of that panel. I'll call on individuals to either ask their question or offer a comment, and then at that point you can unmute yourself and join the discussion. So that'll be the structure of our time, as well as the practical ways for you to participate. One other brief thing to bring up. So as I mentioned, the set of panelists that we have joining us this morning have all authored special reports on this subject for the U.S. Institute of Peace, and we'll be providing links to those special reports if you're interested in digging into any of the topic of external support to movements for transparency, accountability, and good governance in any of these countries. Those links will be both in the session page on the IACC website, as well as we'll put them here in the chat in the Zoom session. All right, well then with that, I'll briefly introduce each of our panelists, and then we can begin with our discussion. So first we have Shazka Byerly. Shazka Byerly is a senior fellow at the Terrorism, Transnational Crime, and Corruption Center at the Scar School of Government and Policy at George Mason University. She's a researcher, writer, and educator in nonviolent action with a focus on anti-corruption and accountability, and is the author of the book Curtailing Corruption, People, Power for Accountability and Justice. She's held numerous positions in the anti-corruption and nonviolent action space, including with the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict, the Center for Transatlantic Relations at Johns Hopkins University, and as a senior research advisor and Jennings Randolph Senior Fellow at the United States Institute of Peace. She co-authored the special report, Nonviolent Action in Myanmar, Challenges and Lessons for Civil Society and Donors, which we'll discuss today. Next, we have Olena Tregub. She's the Secretary General of the Independent Defense Anti-Corruption Committee, an international oversight body created by Transparency International Ukraine to strengthen democratic oversight over defense spending, increase accountability and transparency of the sector. She was previously Director for International Assistance Coordination at Ukraine's Ministry of Economic Development and Trade. And she's the author of the USIP Special Report, Ukrainian Activism for Transparency and Accountability, 2 Steps Forward, 1 Step Back. Next, we have Hussein Khalid. Hussein is the Executive Director of Hockey Africa, an organization seeking to foster the progressive realization of human rights, and a longtime activist agitating for the rights of grassroots communities in Kenya and across East Africa. Hussein is also the co-author of the USIP Special Report, Conflict Prevention in Kenya, Combating Corruption Through Nonviolent Action. Finally, acting as our rapporteur for this session, we have my colleague Miranda Rivers. Miranda is a program specialist for the program on nonviolent action at USIP, where she conducts applied research on social movements and supports training and education efforts for movements working to advance justice and sustainable peace. She's also the co-author of the special report, Curbing Corruption After Conflict, Anti-Corruption Mobilization in Guatemala. So we have a real all-star set of panelists with us here today. I think we'll be able to have a really interesting discussion. And I want to start this discussion by turning to Shazka. Now, Shazka, you've done a lot of broad cross-national research on nonviolent action in the anti-corruption space. And many might think of anti-corruption efforts as primarily a top-down elite activity pushed by international actors. But your research is focused on the contribution of grassroots nonviolent action to the fighting against corruption. Can you give us a broad overview of how nonviolent action against corruption works, and maybe what are some of its major strengths and weaknesses? And Shazka, if you could unmute yourself, please.
Okay. Thank you, Jonathan, and thanks for this opportunity. I mean, when we think about nonviolent action to fight and impact corruption, it can be oftentimes a little different from nonviolent action applied to other kinds of struggles. For example, very broad-based democracy struggles, even though those are often involving struggles against corruption. But nonviolent action actually can be applied to preventing corruption, to mitigating and rectifying the effects of corruption, and to think about and to basically disrupt corruption as a system. So when we think about corruption, we often think of the Transparency International definition, which is the abuse of power for private gain. But it also can be the abuse of power for economic gain, for political gain, and this abuse of power involves many types of vested interests and many types of complex relationships. So when we start to think of it that way, we realize that corruption is actually functioning in a system. It's not just a collection of interactions between a corruptor and a corruptee. Once we start thinking about corruption as a system, then we start to see how and why, when citizens mobilize to target corruption, they very often have a profound impact. And the dynamics of this is very interesting. And what I share with you is basically the wisdom that comes from what citizens and campaigns and movements are doing around the world. So the credit all goes to them and their ingenuity and their brilliance. What nonviolent action does in the corruption sphere is in a way, it disrupts, as I mentioned, the systems of corruption. It also involves the dynamic of engagement. So it's engaging with those in power, elites, whether they're in the state, in the political system, or even non-state elites, for example, corporations. And it also involves engaging with the public. And this is something that I should just mention, USIP has done also some very important work. They have produced a very valuable research action guide called Synergizing Nonviolent Action and Peace Building, which brings together the dynamics of strategies and tactics involved in nonviolent action and peace building. And engagement comes out of that peace building realm. The third dynamic is the power of numbers. So meaning the power of numbers of citizens that are participating. But that doesn't mean one needs millions of citizens. It all depends on the context. So as Hussein Khalid could mention from what I learned from learning about what he and others have done in Kenya, is that the power of numbers can be the power of numbers within a small community. But when everybody in that community is involved, that's a lot of numbers in that context. So when we think about nonviolent action, again, in the anti-corruption realm, we can also think about short-term outcomes and long-term outcomes. And again, in the short term, nonviolent action can lead to micro changes. So within a community tracking how money is spent in a budget, or tracking what's happening in their local school, and tracking repairs that should be made, teachers that are absent or are present, things like that. It can also involve macro goals. So it could be pushing at the national level for example, right to information legislation, or the creation of an anti-corruption commission. So that's the beauty of nonviolent action too. It can be applied at the micro and at the macro level. And in the long term, the changes that we can see in the long term can be things that are more maybe tough to measure, but equally important. So that can be changes in attitudes, changes in norms, and changes in practices. So for example, if there is right to information legislation, how is the practice of that changing? How is it implemented? How can civil society groups and citizens actually make use of that legislation? So for example, this morning there was a really interesting presentation in an earlier session by a civic leader in Lebanon about how they took all this data from the government and basically created a user-friendly platform so people could access the information that they needed about the spending of the government down to very granular levels. So I think that's the really exciting thing. And I mean, so in a way, I've been alluding to the strengths of nonviolent action. And I mean, I'd just like to read a quote from Dr. Iftikhar Zaman, who's the executive director of Transparency International in Bangladesh. And he said something this morning in a session. He said, people with citizen action, people hold power to account, and they can turn themselves from victims into catalysts, and they have ownership in the change, and that's really important. And I think he really hit on something about a strength of nonviolent action. I mean, in terms of weaknesses, I think the challenge we all know in the anti-corruption field is that it's ongoing. That corruption doesn't just vanish. There's always corruption, and there's always a struggle, a fight to curb it, to mitigate it, to control it, to eradicate it. And a challenge is that it's nonlinear. Like all kinds of social change, progress in fighting corruption is also nonlinear. As the report from Ukraine that Olena Treguba is going to talk about, you can make 2 steps forward and then have 1 step back. But then you still have the opportunity to keep making progress, even if there are some setbacks. And I would say the last challenge isn't really a challenge. It's more of something to keep in mind, that when we talk about anti-corruption, it's against something bad. So it's focusing on the negative. But there's also the positive side to it. And that's what we want to achieve, what we want to gain, the progress, the social justice, the improvement in people's lives that we together want to gain when we act together. So it is that balance between the two that's really important in the struggle. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Shaska. That's a wonderful overview of nonviolent action in the anti-corruption space more broadly. So you've also, of course, as I mentioned, co-authored one of these special reports on external support to social movement actors mobilizing for accountability, good governance, democracy, equitable development, and peace building. Your special report was specifically focusing on Myanmar. What can you tell us about nonviolent action for these interrelated goals and how it fits or doesn't fit with these broad trends in how nonviolent action is used to fight against corruption?
That's a really good question. If I can just take 20 seconds, I'm going to try to share the screen of the report because I'd like to, let me turn this off. I'd like to just acknowledge the co-authors of the report and acknowledge their work, because they're the ones who actually designed and carried out the field work in 3 different locations in Myanmar. So I have this up, so I'm going to see if I can do the share screen here. If I can't, then you can see the screen. You can find the report on the link, but let me see if I can do.
Shaska, if you're not able to share the screen, you could also, I mean, you can share the link to the report and then maybe also mention their names specifically now and maybe the organizations that they work for.
Okay, thank you. Can you see it now, actually? Is it?
Yes.
Is it?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So I'd like to acknowledge the 3 researchers and co-authors, La Ring, Kin Sandar Nguyen, and Nist Pianchupat. So they deserve great credit for this report. Going back to what we can learn. I mean, I think that thinking about this report, I mean, this was one of the great lessons that came out of this, was that this and other, basically, when we look at what people do when they mobilize on the ground and how they frame their challenges and how they frame their struggles, is that they see problems as interrelated. They don't compartmentalize problems. They basically, if one goes to Myanmar or to many other countries and say, are you doing peace? Are your goals related to peace building? Are they related to anti-corruption? Are they related to accountability and good governance? Are they related to democracy? Are they related to equitable development? In most cases, they would probably say, yeah, they're related to most of those things, because all of those things in reality are interrelated. So I think that's a really important lesson for us in the international community and for the anti-corruption struggle, that so much of anti-corruption is really linked to all these fundamental problems in societies that people face and that people are harmed by. And that was clear in Myanmar. And I think one can see that dynamic very in a very pronounced manner in other countries where there is a recent legacy of violent conflict, and even violent conflict that may be going on at the moment. So even from our own special reports in Guatemala, beyond our special reports, countries like Afghanistan, one can see this, and Indonesia in the past 20 years. So, I mean, we can learn from that. I mean, and I think a second point is that what we can learn from this research and what others are doing at the grassroots is that there's really not a standard profile of an anti-corruption actor or an anti-corruption protagonist and leader. People wear many hats. So interestingly, in Myanmar, the researchers found that, you know, in one movement in Kachin state, the leaders actually came from registered NGOs. Whereas, and also, for example, in another campaign that was going on in Yangon, in the biggest city, the sort of the financial and sort of cultural hub of the country. Whereas in other cases, you may have activists, people who may not be sort of in the registered formal part of civil society, but they can be the catalysts. So oftentimes we may overlook those who are actually the catalysts and the change makers on the ground because they don't fit perhaps our view of what is an anti-corruption protagonist or an anti-corruption organization. And so it's interesting, and we can learn to look for what are the groups on the ground, formal and informal, that have high citizen participation. They may not call themselves anti-corruption, but citizens are mobilizing and contributing their time voluntarily. And they can be faith-based groups. They can be, student groups, which we're more familiar with. But they can be even groups that are very culturally and contextually specific. So in Myanmar, some of the biggest, you could say, high citizen participation groups have to do with, for example, providing services, providing free funerals to people who cannot, to families who cannot afford that. But they involve a lot of participation. So again, looking beyond what we sort of think of as the standard, I think is something very important that's come out of the research. And I think also the last point I'll just make about this is that it all goes back to the people. And what we saw in Myanmar and in other countries around the world is that people, that the groups, whether they're formal or informal, that are involving citizens are basically bridging together abstract concepts or abstract notions about, for example, corruption or transparency and accountability with people's everyday problems and grievances and their everyday hopes about what they would like to see in terms of a better life on a daily basis. And it is, and I think the great lesson is that it's possible. It's not something that's difficult. It's something that's done all the time at the grassroots.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Jessica. I'll just have one quick follow-up before we move on to one of these others, one of our other panelists. So of course, one big focus of our session is on support by international actors for nonviolent action in this space. You mentioned one potential lesson about looking for non-traditional characters, not just the usual suspects of anti-corruption activists. Are there any other sort of outstanding lessons specifically for international actors interested in supporting nonviolent action for transparency, accountability, and good governance that's come out of the research from Myanmar?
From Myanmar. Yeah, I mean, thanks, Jonathan. That's a really good question. And I mean, just to keep it brief, I think, I mean, just two important takeaways, and I'm happy to, like, if some people want to like talk about this more later, to, you know, share more from the report. But two big takeaways are that it's often the case that the focus of international actors is on the capital city registered NGOs. And there's nothing wrong with that. But when the focus is basically, the bulk of the focus is on that, and the groups and organizations that are outside of the capital and other parts of the country do not receive that attention or avenues of support, one, they lose out. Two, the international actors lose out because they're often change makers. And three, this can inadvertently create divisions within civil society. And in a way, I mean, given that civic space is closing, given the realities of the COVID pandemic, the more civil society can be enabled and supported to be united, the more of an impact it can have and the stronger it can be to face these challenges. So I think that's just something, one important lesson that has come out of the Myanmar research. Interestingly, another important lesson is that they had some very interesting, you know, the field research was actually interviewing people in different parts of the country, civic actors, NGO actors, activists, social movement leaders. And they had some interesting ideas about what kind of support could be useful. One is actually solidarity. And that's not money. It's support. It's watching and having, you know, shining a light on what's happening, being, you know, illuminating what's happening to people who are getting arrested, perhaps giving awards to people who are doing great work but are facing repression, magnifying to the international community what's happening. Another interesting thing they said, and this does happen a lot, but is enabling people from one part of the country to have contact with counterparts in other parts of the country. And then enabling people from one country to have contact with people in other countries in the region, and perhaps more broadly. And interestingly, that was mentioned by someone, again, this morning from Yaramar in Senegal at a session that I attended. And he said that this is what they were doing in Western Africa. And they said that they were doing this because it was necessary, it was strategically important and valuable. And then finally, you know, a lot of international actors have constraints. They cannot, for example, interact at the very grassroots. However, one idea that came out of this research was that to create pooled funding, for example, so that there can be a pooled funding mechanism that can directly interact with grassroots groups and actors, even if a big donor just doesn't have the administrative and bureaucratic wherewithal to be able to do that on a regular basis.
Great, thanks so much, Shazka. I'm going to turn to Hussein now. So Hussein, first question for you. In your report on anti-corruption movements in Kenya, you say that although many Kenyans are critical of corruption, most are apathetic and skeptical of efforts to engage them. And to awaken the populace, organizers must work better to link corruption to people's everyday challenges and lives, something that Shazka was also mentioning in the context of Myanmar. I'm curious, has the COVID-19 pandemic helped or hurt that awakening? Has it made people in Kenya more aware or less aware of the impact of corruption on their lives?
Thank you very much, Jonathan. And let me take this opportunity to greet everyone and to, of course, welcome all our participants for joining in. and of course for Shazka also for giving us a very excellent introduction, which would make it easy for the rest of us to actually say our bit. I would say that the COVID-19 pandemic has, particularly in Kenya, has exacerbated the situation in terms of corruption. Some of you may know that in Kenya, millions of dollars have actually gone missing. Money that was actually received for purposes of addressing the pandemic, money that was originally meant to actually provide medicine, money that was actually, supposed to save lives, from World Bank, from USAID, from UK Aid and other international institutions. It's discouraging to actually learn that state entities have found ways of actually colluding with service providers and others to defraud the government and actually make away with huge sums of money, through corrupt means. And this has raised a lot of concerns from the populace who have come up, in such huge numbers to decry the situation and to demand for action to be taken. Unfortunately, as is in Kenya and many other African countries, the government, working together with other state authorities, always find a way of hoodwinking the public that something is actually going to be done, but then in the end, nothing is actually done. So in the case of Kenya, we've lost millions of dollars in shady deals, in corrupt ways, and this means that the local citizen has suffered, that people have died because certain individuals want to gain, personally gain and make money for themselves. And this situation has made the people to rise up and even question whether COVID-19 is truly a pandemic or whether it's just another gimmick to make money and for officials to swindle the public. So as we have it, we've had movements, of course, from the civil society to try and highlight the problem, particularly with the COVID-19 funds that were embezzled. And we've had various initiatives in different parts of the country coming out to demand for action to be taken. And we've seen, for example, institutions like Haki Africa, we've held public demonstrations in Mombasa, in Nairobi, to demand that action must be taken and those responsible for stealing COVID-19 funds be taken to court. But then, of course, the state has used the same COVID-19 excuse to silence, or rather to rein in on protesters who came out to protest. And they said, well, there's social distancing, we can't allow people to go out to the streets and to demand, for whatever it is that they're doing. But at the same time, just as they are trying to silence protesters, we see politicians going out, because presently we do have some sort of campaigns ongoing, but politicians are allowed to go out to meet the public in huge numbers, totally ignoring the safety or health regulations that have been put out there. People are not wearing masks, there's no social distancing. But when civil society goes out to protest against the corruption witnessed in the funds that have been embezzled, then the police are the first ones to react and to muzzle civil society when they're doing this. So I would say, in a way, the COVID-19 pandemic directly has had an issue, because we've seen millions of dollars, as I've said, meant for the sick that have been corruptly, I would say, misdirected to personal pockets. But then also this has had far-reaching consequences, because people have lost faith in the government. People have lost faith in anti-corruption institutions, because they're saying, if even money for the sick is being stolen and no one is doing anything to address these concerns, then people feel that, then nothing can actually be handled. And for civil society, for us, it has always been a challenge, how to make sure that the experiences we are living in as a country, how do we make sure that the local citizen understands the issue, and then to develop anger to a certain level that they would come out and say, enough is enough? I think that's the challenge that we have as civil society. How do we get the public themselves to take the lead in demanding, for action? We sometimes are accused of, as civil society, because we get funding from international donors and all that. Sometimes we are accused of driving a foreign agenda. This is what the government likes to say. In as much as it doesn't affect us, because we know what we're standing for is for the people of Kenya, to an extent, some people listen to what the government is saying. And they say, oh, they're driving a foreign agenda, they're doing this, they're doing that. But the question has always been, what about the local Kenyan? Doesn't he feel the pinch? They are, dying. People, for example, in this COVID-19 pandemic issue, we've had many people. Kenya is one of the worst affected countries in Eastern Africa with high numbers of infections. We are now in the second wave of the pandemic. We are seeing rising numbers. We are almost going back to lockdown again. But then we don't understand, the people are not feeling that. You can't feel the anger. And you wonder, what will it take for the people themselves to rise up? We call for public protests, we call for demonstrations. Yes, we get huge numbers, but it's 1-2 days. When you get to the third day, people are, losing that concentration. And I think to many, it's like they cannot even fathom, what this is about. Majority of the Kenyan population are poor. We have a high percentage living below the poverty line. So when we tell them millions of dollars have actually gone into people's pockets, majority of them can't even imagine what millions of dollars is. They don't know what this means. And I think this is an issue I raised in the USIP paper. How do we make people understand that actually this money that has been stolen in one way or another would have benefited them as individuals? We need to translate these figures into, let's say, number of schools. Let's say, for example, the money that has been stolen would have been able to build 100 or 1,000 schools in Kenya. Or maybe we can talk about roads, like so much money was stolen that would be in a position to tarmac the road from this corner to this corner. I think we need to start, thinking of it in a different way, because we've always talked of huge sums of money, but then people don't understand. And maybe that contributes to people not feeling the pinch. Again, the COVID-19 pandemic, as we've seen it, it has also, in a way, silenced civil society, because civil society mainly engage the public through public forums. We engage the public through meetings, through conferences and such kinds of avenues. But with the COVID-19, we've seen less and less of that. So we haven't been in a position to actually go out there to meet the people and to speak to them freely. So majority of us are now, only now, taking up social media. Majority of civil society in Kenya are now learning how to communicate online. Majority of civil society are thinking of communicating en masse using, the internet, using platforms such as Facebook and Instagram and all that, so that we can get the message out. So for a period of time thereabouts, we couldn't, reach to the people, and the public remained very quiet. To an extent, I think Shazka spoke about, or rather is working now under the counterterrorism initiative also. We even saw, because of the silence, because of the lack of communication, because of the social disintegration, we saw that radical elements took advantage of the situation. The fact that churches were closed down, mosques were closed down. So the mainstream religious entities were not in operation. So we saw, some forms of radicalization re-emerging, from communities. And this also basically communicates that, people are working behind the clock to find ways and means of engaging in extremists issues, ideologies, and this is all as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic situation. So I would say, in my opinion, the COVID-19 pandemic has exacerbated the situation. Majority, we just finished, and this is my last point as I speak, we just finished doing a social audit of a local government. And we released the report, I believe it was 3 weeks back. And we actually found that many people were just amazed at what was being done without necessarily looking at the facts and figures behind what was being done. Because many people felt that whatever services they were getting, this was actually additional to what they were supposed to get. So anyone who was doing even the minutest of things, they would think, wow, they are actually going out of their way to do it. And to an extent, not even questioning how much has been spent to make that minute thing available to the people. So we found that so much money was actually spent, but because people didn't understand what they were to expect, even the little that came about, they were grateful for, but then this meant a lot of money in the background went to other places, and particularly pockets of different state actors. Yeah, I think I would stop at that in case you have a question.
Great, thank you, Hussein. That's a wonderful overview of how COVID-19 has impacted the anti-corruption struggles in Kenya. I think I'll just, one more question related to the international or the foreign dimension. So one of the things that you mentioned in your report about Kenya is that foreign donors have sent mixed signals about whether fighting corruption in Kenya is a priority. So I'd be curious to hear what you mean by mixed signals and how foreign donors can be clearer about that fighting corruption is a priority, especially in light of these particular challenges of fighting corruption in Kenya that you were just mentioning.
Yeah, so thank you very much. That's a wonderful question, Jonathan. The mixed signals have been actually on two folds. One is that, they have kept funding government projects, even projects that they were not sure about. So we were concerned and we were like, look, clearly there are issues. And I think in the past, as international actors, you've raised concerns about some of these issues. The fact that you continue to fund, it means that the governments will continue to corruptly acquire public resources for their own personal benefits. So, the fact that they were already engaging with the government, that's one way we felt they were not sincere. And this was a mixed signal. And the mixed signal was that some of them were like very clear, until certain standards have been met, then they will not fund. But others were like, we actually need to fund so that they do meet those standards for us to be able now to fund comfortably. So it was like, neither here nor there. There are those that were very clear that we must reach a certain threshold for us to fund. And then there are those that are saying, for countries like Kenya that have not met that threshold, these are the countries that actually need support or need training or need capacity building for them to be able to reach that particular threshold. And then the second bit of the mixed signals is that some of them came out openly and said this amount of money has not been accounted for, and as a government, we cannot continue to support this. Countries like the US, the UK, in the past have been very vocal and have spoken openly about funds that have been misused. They've even publicly, using press conferences and press statements, said we are going to suspend funding because we are seeing this money being lost instead of serving the people. So that is good. But then you also have other governments that are saying, we have to engage in a diplomatic, I would say, give and take. When money is lost, we don't go public announcing and embarrassing the government. We find ways of addressing these issues. And for us as Kenyans, we would like to name and shame so that we know the corrupt individuals within our government, so that we can follow up with them, make sure these people are arrested and they face their time in court. But when donors refuse to share information, when they refuse to be open or transparent about how they are funding the government, then to us, this sends mixed signals. That yes, they want to support the fight against corruption, but they're not willing to share information, to share statistics, to share facts that would help us as a people to follow up with our government and ensure that those corrupt officials are held to account. So that is what we were referring to in the report.
Great, thank you so much, Hussein. All right, I want to turn to Olena now. So Olena, in your report on Ukraine, which was released in May 2019, you note that it remains to be seen what the effect of the election of President Zelensky in April 2019 would have on anti-corruption efforts. So now it's been roughly a year and a half. And I'm curious if you have a better sense of his impact on anti-corruption reform, and perhaps how the Zelensky administration has balanced the COVID-19 crisis and the anti-corruption agenda.
Sure. Thank you, Jonathan, for your question. Yeah, it's a very interesting discussion as we see different dynamics that especially it's a global pandemic, COVID-19, but there are different outcomes for different countries. I listened to what Hussein had to say about the situation in Kenya. In Ukraine, it's a different situation, and I will elaborate later on it further. Just to give you a brief answer, it's what happened 1 year after Zelensky was elected. Well, according to Transparency International Corruption Perception Index, we fell. We fell by 2 points, and we used to be in 2018, before his election, we used to be 120 out of 180 countries, and 1 year after Zelensky presidency, or at least like more than half a year after his presidency, we are 126. Well, it's a minor change, but it reflects more or less accurately the fact that unfortunately we didn't see the results that many anticipated, and corruption transformed under Zelensky, and I would call this transformation like, you know, corruption anarchy, because under the previous president, Poroshenko, we heard a lot about big politicians affiliated with the president, affiliated with influential players in the government. And there were a lot of high-level political corruption scandals. Under Zelensky, we do not see that. We don't see any top politicians from Zelensky team involved in corruption and investigations about them. At the same time, the corruption became really massive because essentially the way, yes, Transparency International defines corruption when you use your entrusted power, your position for the private gain. This is exactly what's happening in Ukraine. Wherever you have the opportunity, you for corruption, and you are entrusted with some powers. Either you are a policeman, you are a judge, you are the local governor, you are the head of the forestry department. You use it for your private gain, and that's what's happening right now. And it's just getting really out of control because essentially the state institutions, they remain weak. And unfortunately, in my report, you know, I focused on this promising anti-corruption infrastructure that Ukrainians built after 2014 Euromaidan revolution, when there was an idea that maybe if we focus on building new institutions instead of reforming old ones, those new institutions will help us solve the problem. But unfortunately, it turned out to be not a silver bullet, definitely, because still we don't have any tangible results that the population would feel, I would say. Of course, I wrote in my report about the fact that the infrastructure was lacking key component, the final component, which was called the High Anti-Corruption Court of Ukraine. And because of that, in the previous iteration of power under Poroshenko, there were no results. We thought so. But then this court was established already in 2019 in September. And now in September 2020, we celebrated 1 year of anti-corruption court. And essentially, yes, they basically sent people to jail, around 8 people, but it's not what the society expected. And you know, the scale of that sentences and the corruption was not really serious, because they sent one judge for a bribe of $2,500, one state official for $5,000. And of course, the scale of corruption in Ukraine is essentially, you know, hundreds of millions of dollars, not those amounts. But nobody involved in those more serious scheme has not gone to jail yet. And society understands now more and more that there are serious problems with our legislation. For example, with the criminal code of Ukraine, it allows very broad opportunities for those who have money to hire very good lawyers to protect themselves. For example, we have a provision that lawyers can use and manipulate that. You can take materials from your case, and if it's a criminal case, corruption case, and demand to study those materials for years and years, and there is no deadline. So it's written, essentially, our legislation is written in a way to protect people from responsibility, but not all people, but those people who have basically resources. This is, I would say, the main update, number one. And update number two is that now we have even more kind of serious and sad situation, which developed essentially in the last few weeks. It's when the deep state, I would say, the corrupt officials of the Ukrainian state, and I mean here the the power of the judiciary, when they basically struck back against those anti-corruption institutions, and the judges of the Constitution Court ruled out that essentially these anti-corruption institutions, they are not really constitutional, well, to be more precise, they ruled out to block the first institution in this chain, the National Anti-Corruption, National Corruption Prevention Agency, which initiated those corruption cases, which supplied very often those cases to this chain, and basically it was blocked. The website with electronic declarations, which was another win of the revolution of dignity, that the society could see the earnings of basically several 100,000 officials in the country. It was shut down overnight due to the decision of the court. And also the High Anti-Corruption Court, as a result of this decision, had to close cases against many of the top-level officials, those actually officials that are of very much interest to the society, probably you will not be surprised, to hear that if the official was very high and very skilled in what he was doing or she was doing, they did corruption in a way that it was like impeccable. This is why the only way to open case for them was for the difference in e-declaration comparing to their lifestyle and different apartments and properties and vehicles that they were acquiring. So, but now this, of course, this even threatens Ukrainian visa-free regime with the European Union. So everybody got very stressed, and Zelensky and his power, they started to find a solution. Now they try to do it through the parliament to basically roll this back and allow the proper functioning of the anti-corruption legislation and anti-corruption institutions. Yet it just shows you that essentially it brings me to my first point, that basically situation in Ukraine in terms of anti-corruption and good governance, it just got out of control because essentially these judges, there are a lot of speculations that these judges, they were manipulated by different oligarchs and probably some Russian interests as well. The same way many of the Ukrainian TV channels are manipulated by those oligarchs and by Russian interests. And Zelensky, and even though he has majority in the government, he cannot do much about it. I just wanted to go back a little bit to the point that Hussein made about anti-corruption activists in Kenya being called foreign agents. Well, in Ukraine, it was not really a big deal. It wasn't really so before Zelensky. But after Zelensky took power, and basically his grab on power was weaker than Poroshenko's, these anti-Ukrainian actors, they became more active, and they created the narrative, very similar narrative to what Hussein was describing, but these people in Ukrainian version are not called foreign agents, they are called Sorosiata, or if I translate it from Ukrainian, children of George Soros. Basically, the idea is that everybody who is pro-democratic, pro-European, pro-Western, liberal, they are somehow related to George Soros. Essentially, George Soros wants to take over Ukraine and Ukrainian land and resources and so on. Why this narrative became an issue for anti-corruption struggle in Ukraine in the latest months? Well, it's because this narrative was very much developed by different TV channels, and to the extent that now even like every cab driver in Ukraine would say, oh, there are so many of those children of Soros in Ukraine, and he wouldn't even like understand what it is for him. But the idea is that this narrative tried to discredit anti-corruption activists as somebody, who were pushing for those foreign interests, and also to discredit the anti-corruption infrastructure as something that was imposed on Ukraine from outside, and that it's not really working after all. So it's essentially what's happening right now, and the other conclusion of both civil society, I would say, and international community is that Ukraine really didn't pay enough attention to judiciary. And everybody was focusing. Everybody thought that building those new anti-corruption institutions would help tackle corruption, but essentially it turns out that the reform of the judiciary is basically the key, and judiciary, they are the heart of the Ukrainian corruption, because you can go and illegally, in a corrupt way, bribe, say, the notary service to steal a plot of land in Ukraine. And if we had a functioning judicial system, you can regain, like the other person who suffered can regain their rights in land. But because the judiciary would be also bribed, there is no way to protect yourself. And also, of course, it emboldens corruption on a massive, in a very broad and massive way, from top to bottom and from bottom to top. And so everybody now, international community, is focusing very much on the reform of the judiciary, and it is the condition of our IMF loan right now, which is now being delayed exactly because of that reason. We don't make any progress right now in the reform of the judiciary. And also it's now a condition in other assistance packages to Ukraine. Finally, going back to COVID, it's interesting that in Ukrainian case, to begin with, we didn't have that much of assistance from abroad for COVID. We had some, but predominantly it's Ukrainian budget. It's around, the COVID fund in Ukraine is around 2.3, equivalent of 2.3 US billion. And the funny thing about it is that a lot of organizations are monitoring the expenditure. It's all transparent, and through Freedom of Information Act inquiries, you can easily get all the information how the money is being spent. And even I would say after COVID hit, the donors in their calls for different project proposals, they immediately started asking from activists, from NGOs, to come up with some COVID-related ideas. So many organizations that do anti-corruption turned to COVID-related expenditures, and now we have one COVID fund, but we have multiple organizations monitoring it, and we even had reports of 2 organizations, Kiev-based organizations that are like pretty big organizations that were analyzing essentially the same data because of this tendency to do something COVID-related. And yes, as a result now, of course, the society knows very well how the money is spent. And the very strange thing about it is that more than 50%, the COVID fund already, all this 66 billion hryvnias or 2 billion US, the money is now spent. And we don't have any more money in the COVID fund, which is not allocated. And over 50% was spent on construction of roads. And this is very surprising. How is COVID related to roads? And it was the program of Zelensky to build roads, but at the same time, there was also a huge lobby to allow building the roads, because in Ukrainian condition, the percentage of graft that happens during the road construction can be, up to 40%. So road business became somehow very interesting during COVID, and essentially, not out of this money, out of this 2.3 billion, only $300,000 was spent on medical supplies. All the rest was spent on different subsidies for people who lost jobs and some other stuff. But now society, knowing that the money was not spent properly, is very angry about the fact that Ukrainian hospitals do not have oxygen concentrators. We're not even talking about ventilators at this point, because ventilators are not that much available anyway in Ukraine. But oxygen concentrators, they save a lot of people who have, also to be saved. It's not something complicated, but now Ukrainians procure those for their homes. One oxygen concentrator is around 1,000 to 2,000 euro, and people are just getting it in their home in case they get sick. So it just shows the failure of the government, but also it shows that the public transparently sees what's happening and knows what to expect. So yeah, I would stop here.
Yeah, thank you so much, Elena. That's again a really wonderful overview of kind of what's happened in Ukraine since you wrote your report. And of course, one of the themes that comes up quite a bit, both in the report and I would say in the summary that you just raised as well, is a lot of kind of frustration and a sense of despondency about inability to move forward in the anti-corruption space, and that this kind of despondency in turn, as you mentioned in the report, has led to low levels of domestic engagement. How can activists, people who are in the anti-corruption space combat this sense of pessimism and kind of keep people engaged and hopeful for pushing forward? Are there any strategies that you can offer?
Well, apparently, because Ukrainian activists and civil society never managed to mobilize people for anti-corruption related events, struggles, I cannot give lessons in this. For me, it is very interesting to hear that in Kenya, civil society is speaking about some mass gatherings in Ukraine when Constitutional Court blocked anti-corruption reform. We had like 200, 300 people protesting for a few days, and many of those people were those who work for anti-corruption NGOs. So at the same time, if you speak to people in the street, they were upset about the decision of the court. They understood the implications. They were upset, but they were not that upset to go protest in front of the court. So my guess is that, well, according to their different sociological studies in Ukraine, people tend to mobilize for anti-corruption related struggles when there is an issue that affects them personally. So it is done more effectively, like Shaska was saying. She was giving a lot of examples of community based mobilization. So yes, communities, when there is some problem with the river, with the building, then that affects people or their relatives, then they mobilize. If it's a problem for the whole country, I don't see the way to mobilize people specifically for anti-corruption cause.
Great, thank you so much. So as I mentioned at the beginning of the session, we want this session to be very interactive. And so we have some general questions that we're curious to hear both from our panelists and also from you and our audience. So if I'm going to sort of put out a couple of questions, and if you are interested in offering a comment or a thought on these questions, please, again, just use the raise hand function in Zoom, and I will call on you. So the first, of course, something that all of our panelists have discussed is the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. And so we wanted to turn this question out to you, our audience, as well. How has COVID-19 impacted citizen efforts to combat corruption in your country? And how have citizens responded? Are there similarities or differences to what Olena, Hussein, and Shazka have described. So yes, any thoughts, comments, or questions from our audience members are welcome now. And if there are none, then we can move on to another. We can move on to another question. All right. So I see Jennifer Figueroa. So yeah, if you can unmute yourself and feel free to offer your comment.
Hi, I'm from Panama, in Latin America. And well, this COVID pandemic has been very hard for us because last year we started fighting against the corruption in the kind of the Congress here. And because they steal a lot of money. So the problem now that it's highlighted is how nurses, the people, the doctors, they are not getting paid, but we still see a raise in the role in the payment for those in the government. They call that for austerity, but then they spend a lot of money to pay their expenses, to pay publicity, advertisement, things that are not important right now. And those who are in the front line, who are fighting against this virus, they are not getting paid. And when they go to the streets to fight for that, they are not even being recognized by the president. So we are very frustrated right now. There is a group that goes to the streets kind of every week to fight against this, to call out and invite people, but there is a lot of people mobilizing. I think that there is a lack of education about what's going on in the country. People do not understand about how giving money to everyone is actually making us harm, because we are growing our debt, we are affecting our economic development. So those are things that are happening right now in Panama. And I was wondering what can international actors can do, because there are a little people here that are really wanting this change, because the majority doesn't know that they need this change. The majority thinks, oh, that's their problem, it's not affecting me directly, but actually it is. But they do not know that, or they do not care about that. So yeah, thank you.
Great, thank you so much for that comment. And it sounds like there are a lot of similar themes to what our panelists have brought up before. So actually, maybe one question that arises and has come up several times is this issue of public engagement and people not necessarily seeing the impact of corruption in their daily lives. And Hussein, you mentioned a couple of perhaps public relations strategies that anti-corruption activists might use to highlight the sort of direct impact of corruption on people's lives. I'd be curious to hear you talk a little bit more about that. Are there sort of particular strategies that your organization or others in Kenya have used that have really enabled people to see the direct impact of corruption on their lives?
Thank you, Jonathan, and also thank you, Jennifer Figueroa, for sharing the experience from your country. I think it's something that we can relate with. As Kenya, COVID-19 funds have been misused and the hospitals don't have medicine. But, members of parliament, we are hearing they want to change the constitution. They now want medical covers for themselves and their families, and even their concubines, if I may call it that way, in Kenya. Yet the National Health Insurance Fund, the government has said it will not pay for any COVID-19 related illness in hospital, and this is what majority of the Kenyan population is actually relying on. For the insurance covers, the health insurance covers, they've also come out openly and said even if you have medical insurance cover, they will not meet the costs of COVID-19. So basically, the people have been left on their own. If you get sick now, whether you have insurance cover or whether you are covered through the government system, it means it will not work for you. You know, so it's pure frustration, just as Jennifer has shared in the example of her country. And this is something that, you know, we are really trying. Like I said, we are now only learning how to use the social media, because everyone is now on social media. With social distancing and people staying at home, it means the only way of connecting is actually using the social media. We're also using arts as a form of communicating. So we are getting activists to do short plays, short skits about corruption. And then once we have this, we share them on social media using the WhatsApp, using Facebook and Instagram to just talk about what is happening in the country. So there are various ways, there are various strategies that we are only now beginning to realize, to adopt, to raise that awareness. But more importantly, we know that we need to get the people to understand what is happening. And in many instances, corruption is, you know, talked about in a grand manner. You know, it's so huge that the local citizen cannot see themselves, you know, in that picture. So we want to disintegrate the data so that we can, for example, tell someone, if it wasn't for corruption, then this would have happened to you, or you would have gained this much. For example, using the example of VAT, you know, value added tax in Kenya, it's around 16%. So we then equate the money that is gathered using VAT and the money that is lost through corruption. And then we look at if that money had not been lost, and if we were to take away, I mean, put it in the VAT kitty, how much would we have saved? And then we tell everyone that out of every 100, so if it's 16%, for example, if they were going to save 10 shillings, you know, if that corrupt money that was lost through corruption wasn't actually lost. So then we tell people out of every 100 shillings that you spend, 100 is roughly $1. Then you would save, for example, 10 shillings, which would translate to 1 cent. And of course, this is huge amounts of money. So the best way is actually to disintegrate the data, make it as easily understood as possible, break down the information that you have on corruption so that that common citizen can feel the urge, the pinch, you know, when money is lost, and all this money goes, you know, towards a few individuals, maybe the executive and maybe parliamentarians, who then benefit only by themselves.
Great, thank you so much, Hussein. All right, it looks like we have a raised hand from Khalid Ali Al-Furjani. So Khalid, please feel free to unmute yourself and you can offer your comment or ask your question. Khalid, are you able to offer your question or comment? Looks like he may not be able to hear us. Are there, given that we have about 10 minutes left in our time together, I want to open the floor to any sort of general questions that people from the audience may have for our panelists, or any points of discussion that members of the audience may want to raise. So yeah, if anyone has any questions related to our topic this morning for any of our panelists, feel free to raise your hand and you can ask that question. All right. Not seeing any questions from the audience, I think I may give another one of our general questions back to our panelists. So from any of you, so Hussein, Olena, or Shazka, I'm curious to hear a little bit more about the ways in which international actors have been most helpful or harmful to these grassroots citizens' efforts to increase transparency and accountability. Any thoughts from any of you on that question? And maybe since we turned to Hussein before, yeah, Olena, why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, sure. Just briefly mention, well, there is huge impact. Essentially, in Ukraine, any progress in reforms is achieved when there is a combination of pressure from international donors together with pressure from civil society. And then something happens, and the political will, of course, should be there, but things happened even without political will. Well, yes, there is this criticism that international actors coordinate only with the institutionalized part of civil society, NGOs, mostly Kiev-based NGOs, and they don't help empower local grassroots movements, and there is absolutely no way for those movements to access funds. And well, the situation remains the same because, well, just because for grassroots movements it's impossible to try get some donor funding because it's way too complicated for them, and this is why I suggested in my report, and I still maintain this view, that donors should facilitate this cooperation between civil society and encourage applications for funds from big organization only if this big organization promises in their application, say, to develop and co-fund a few small local NGOs and help them build their capacity. This is probably the only way for donors to do it.
Great, thank you so much, Olena. Any other questions or points of discussion from the audience? All right, not seeing any. I think I will just at that point then maybe we can wrap up a few minutes early. But before we do that, Hussein or Olena, any sort of closing thoughts that you would like to share before we finish the session?
Yeah, maybe first of all, just to agree with Olena that definitely there's a role for the international community in addressing anti-corruption in various countries, and I think she gave a very good example that you know, we understand that sometimes the need for them to work with more established NGOs is because then perhaps they have a track record, they can account for the funds, you know, they have people who have the necessary experience and qualifications, so that's understandable. But yes, I agree with Olena that they should go an extra mile to require that these established NGOs do work with grassroots groups to also build their capacity to make sure that they can also deliver as expected by the major groups. And then also for the international community, I would urge that there is need for them to become more transparent, for them to share with countries, particularly civil society and others, the kind of funding they offer to different countries. Not only to wait until funds have been misused for them to now come out and shout and scream. I think it's important when they're signing these agreements, when they're saying that they're funding this program or that program, to make that public, to make the information known so that groups can follow up. Civil society can then ensure there is transparency. And the other way they can also help in the anti-corruption movement is by synergizing, by working together. Sometimes we see different countries funding the same issue. You know, they are all plowing funds into one particular project or on one particular sector, when there are many other sectors that would actually could use that kind of support. And this, when the government sees there's so much money in one sector, then that paves way for them to be corrupt and to misuse these funds. That's how I feel the international community should actually do better in terms of fighting or helping countries to address corruption in their country.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Hussein. Lena, yeah, any closing
Yeah,
thoughts?
I'd like just to add 1 second, because, you know, donor coordination and transparency was responsibility of my previous position as an international assistance coordinator of the Ukrainian government. And among other things, I was responsible for establishing a transparent donor coordination platform, OpenAid.gov.ua, where all the funds can be tracked, and donors would exchange information with the society, between themselves, and so on. Well, I did establish it, but the project didn't last long after my departure, precisely because of the fact that donors don't really support the transparency of their own funding. So I absolutely agree with everything that Hussein just said. Yes, it's very difficult for them to be transparent and to coordinate, because donors often represent their national governments. Their governments, they have their priorities, and they would not reset their priorities just for the sake of coordination, because, say, other countries have same priorities and they shouldn't overfund one sector. It's difficult, and I think the only solution is to have a strong government whom donors trust, a pro-reform government, and then this government should take leadership in coordination of international actors who try essentially to help this country to reform and transform. If there is no strong leadership, donors between themselves usually would not coordinate well enough.
Great. Thank you so much, Olena. Thank you so much, Hussein. Unfortunately, it looks like we may have lost Shazka Byerly. She may have dropped off the call. But I just wanted to thank our panelists once again for their thoughts, their comments, their insights, and for writing these excellent special reports on the subject of movements for transparency, accountability, and good governance in their respective countries. Just a reminder, you can the links for those reports are both in the chat here on this Zoom call, as well as on the session page on the IACC website. And with that, I think we'll close our session. Thank you once again to all of you, and I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day.
Yeah, thank you, Jonathan and Shazka, for having us.
Thank you.
Yeah, bye-bye. Have a good evening.